Hello everyone. We're back again.
Hello everyone.
Another episode
We're back again with another
of
episode of the Pact.
International issues every week.
International issues every
today
week.
We're going to talk about
and also
yellow vests. They're known as Gilets. We're going to talk about the initial reasons behind this movement, and also the consequences or achievements of such a protest in France. Today we have two respected guests with us. Mr. Barry Grossman,
political
activist and also analyst from Indonesia. And also we have Mr. Gearóid Ó Colmáin from France, also an author in political commentary. I would like to thank both of you for joining us. I would like to start with the first question concerning the commencing of such a movement in France. And I would like to know about the goals that protesters and French people are trying to see in such a movement in France. Give us your opinion about the first question.
To those of us who were watching at the time, the movement itself, if we can call it that, seemed to arise almost spontaneously at a time when the Macron government was looking at increasing and introducing new fuel taxes. And of course, as we see in most Atlantic world countries, there were already constituencies that felt somewhat fed up with austerity programs and the sorts of governance that they've been used to for the last 20 years. And bearing in mind, of course, that France has always had a relatively strong union movement and certainly large constituencies of people who embrace some form of socialist political view, it was only natural that there would be a response. And to what extent the response was organized, of course, really hasn't been determined, but what we saw suddenly was the emergence of these yellow vests. Initially, it certainly appeared to be the equivalent of a tax revolt, if you like, in much the same way the original American Revolution was a tax revolt. But obviously there were already quite a number of groups within France, and especially in and around Paris, that felt marginalized and disenfranchised. So we saw a lot of people originally coming together around this outpouring of sentiment opposed to not only the Macron government, but the kind of governance that they've been subjected to for a number of years now. There were, of course, people who were affiliated with the transport union who felt hard done by as a result of this government's, the Macron government's plans to essentially reform the public transport system and the public train system. There were other people, quite a few indeed, who had sort of dropped out, if you like, and were living on public lands. There was an area in particular where people had been camped out, essentially squatting for quite a number of years, and the Macron government, with quite a heavy hand, completely cleared them out. And of course, there were people who didn't want to find themselves subjected to still more taxes. So the plan to introduce these fuel taxes, which no doubt President Macron saw as doing his part and France's part to deal with the climate change debate, was a trigger that caused people to rally around it. But perhaps I should bring this up now. We've seen in France for quite a few years now the same thing we've seen throughout Europe and indeed in the United States and Canada and Australia and other places throughout the Atlantic world, and that is people who have been encouraged to either blame government or blame immigrants for their falling standards of living. And within this Yellow Vest movement, certainly one of the key issues that emerged was a demand for reform of the legal process by which people are able to claim refugee status. So there was a whole number of different groups, if you like, that sort of came together in the moment in this outpouring of anger towards the Macron government. In many instances, of course, motivated by issues that are easy to identify with. And that was the beginning of the Yellow Vest movement. And of course, the Macron government didn't respond the way these protesters would have liked the Macron government to respond, but one could be cynical and take the view that it would be impossible for any government to respond the way the Yellow Vest protesters would want them to respond. So we've seen this continue on and on and on and on with relatively little, in many instances, no media coverage. Because, of course, it would be expecting a great deal to expect today's corporate media that make up the Atlantic World Media Cartel to give coverage to a group that is perceived by the establishment to basically be anarchists, looking in effect for some kind of a new revolution. It would be naive to expect that media cartel to deliver to the protesters the very thing they're looking for, which is a platform to reach out and get public support. So we haven't seen a lot of coverage of it, but of course the protests have been and are ongoing. They've been quite violent at times in the sense that the response that's been meted out has been very hard by law enforcement at times, and it's hard to say where it's going to go from here.
What in here I would like if kind of connection between also the so-called movement of Wallace in the United States. I would like to know if we were somehow initiated that movement, or any kind of relation, or that totally separate, have any kind of relation or connection with anyone.
Well, I think it's quite obvious that both movements appeal to a certain segment of the population. There are certain demographics that both the Occupy Wall Street movement motivated and appealed to, and that same demographic in France and Europe and indeed around the world is attracted to varying degrees to the Yellow Vest movement. And on the surface of things, of course, they look to have evolved spontaneously and operated in much the same way. But I'm not sure that that's in fact the reality of the situation. There certainly seems in the background of things to be far more organization on the part of the Yellow Vest movement than we saw in the Occupy movement. The Yellow Vest movement, as well, as far as I've been able to tell, hasn't been quite as clear and rigid about its decision-making process as the Wall Street movement was. The Occupy Wall Street movement was really quite odd in the sense that it took a position that all decision-making had to be made by consensus by anyone who was present at a particular meeting or rally where decisions were being made. And that's, of course, a recipe, for, if you like, for failure, because it's impossible, really, to get consensus from a lot of people on any issue, let alone every issue. And so what we saw with the Wall Street movement was that while many people were motivated by genuine concerns growing out of the GFC and the way the GFC and the banking crisis was handled by the U.S. federal government, it really went nowhere because it really was not able to formulate a coherent and achievable political position, political platform. When we turn to the Yellow Vest movement, certainly there is at least the appearance of, from the start, there having been a whole lot more organization, and that's to be expected given that certainly initially there was quite a heavy involvement by various unions in France, and bearing in mind that France has and has always had a strong union movement. And of course, there also appears to have been a less obvious involvement, perhaps somewhat clandestine, by other political players. And therein lies perhaps some of the problem with the Yellow Vest movement that is at least perceived by observers, namely that the Yellow Vest movement seems to also embrace issues that are associated with the hard right, the alt-right, if you like, namely around immigration and refugees and such matters. In fact, the Yellow Vest movement, has put forward a fairly clear position on a number of issues, which don't, if you take them in their totality, don't fit neatly into a sort of conventional political box. You can't say, oh, well, these are socialists or communists, or this is the left, or it's the hard right, and so forth. Basically, any of the major issues that have come to concern the French public have somehow manifested to varying degrees in this movement. And of course, one of the dominant issues that has been troubling the French for some years now is the issue of immigration. And in many ways, France has been as reactionary and protective of the way it perceives its cultural identity to the exclusion of immigrants as any other country in the Atlantic world, if not more so. So there certainly are some of us who have been watching this who are concerned about the extent to which the way the Yellow Vest movement has emerged left it open to being clandestinely influenced, infiltrated, and used essentially by the alt-right to push a fairly reactionary anti-immigration policy, because it's certainly one of the main issues that has been taken up by the Yellow Vest movement. That is the issue of immigration and people claiming refugee status in France. Other issues, of course, other positions that have been stated by so-called ranking members of the movement have been to abolish the French Senate, because the view is that it doesn't actually represent the people, which may be fair enough. But I think, that's somewhat naive and optimistic to imagine that, a spontaneous protest movement is going to fundamentally change the Constitution and result in the elimination of the Senate. It doesn't follow. Other positions that they've taken, call for a rise in the minimum wage, which of course is understandable. But they've also called for, in somewhat libertarian terms, an overall reduction in taxes. In other words, in many ways, while we can sympathize with what people are feeling in France that identify with the movement, they're really all over the shop in conventional political terms. So it's somewhat difficult to see how they can make any real progress to influence policy making in the Macron government. But what actually happens in the end is yet to be seen. My own view is probably the big winner, ironically, from what's taken place so far, is the alt-right, the hard right in France, in the sense that this movement has galvanized to some extent dissatisfaction with ongoing immigration in France. And this is, of course, a phenomenon that we're seeing all over Europe. And unfortunately, rather than people saying to their governments, look, stop engaging in these adventures in foreign countries like Syria, so that people aren't driven out of their own country and driven to take refuge in France or other countries in Europe, please stop it. Instead, the response that seems to come from the grassroots in all Atlantic world countries is to blame the refugees, to blame the immigrants, and to demand that the process be tightened to keep them out, rather than addressing the root cause of why some immigrants feel the need to make their way to the Atlantic world in order to seek refuge. But certainly there are many similarities and many differences between the two movements, between the Occupy movement and the Yellow Vests. And of course, many of the same speculations have been made about both of them. That is, the extent to which they might be psyops, the extent to which they've been infiltrated by various political players. And of course, all we can do is speculate about these things. We really can't say for certain. I have no doubt that the protesters themselves are, for the most part, very genuine. But they don't comprise a single demographic embracing a very clear cause. And in that sense, the movement itself is open to being manipulated by people who have a somewhat dark agenda. And I'm not convinced that it's even possible for protest movements like this to be particularly effective at anything except perhaps raising a level of public consciousness about the issues that they're ventilating and carving out basically a platform from which a genuine political movement can emerge. Certainly there's no tradition in the Atlantic world, unless we go back many centuries to full-blown revolutions. There's no tradition of protest movements having a serious impact on the policy-making apparatus, especially when the protest movement itself is not a single-issue movement, as we saw with the anti-war movement in the United States in the 60s opposing the Vietnam War. What we're seeing with these protest movements today is people coming forward with a wish list, people who feel disgruntled by the position they find themselves in. And while it's understandable, you know, one of the big issues here of concern is that the world has changed. You know, the Atlantic world is now dealing with essentially a globalized economy. There is no third world anymore. There's the Atlantic world, and then there's everybody else. And amongst all those everyone else, there no longer is a third world, although there still are plenty of people, I think around 4 billion, who are expected to survive on less than $2 or $3 a day. Now, those people, that is the vast majority of people around the world, would no doubt take the view that people in the Atlantic world are doing very well. Some of us take the view that people in the Atlantic world have had far too much for far too long. So one of the troubling things about these protest movements is that there's an air of unreality about people's expectations. Ultimately, they seem not to be based on underlying principle and some informed sense of right and wrong based on a clear external standard. Ultimately, these movements seem to emerge from a sense that people feel they're not getting enough and they want more. In a world in which the reality is that the demographic they come from has already had too much for a very long time. Now, in saying that, of course, we have to recognize that the system of economy that has emerged in the Atlantic world is not fair. There's nothing fair about corporatism. It's not fair to anyone. It's not fair to workers. It's not fair to foreign competitors. It's not fair to small business. It's not fair to anyone. But the notion that somehow in the Atlantic world, protesters are going to be able to turn the clock back to the heyday of the post-war economic boom in the 50s and enjoy the standard of living that people enjoyed then, and that's very naive.
Well, actually, you pointed out these very significant issues and also significant parts of my last question, the future of this whole movement. If you want to go into details and focus on this issue, see the future of such a movement and protest in France? Would it be eventually something successful in the eyes of people of France, or it won't have any kind of achievement finally?
I think your question is a good one, and it really brings up a broader question of what we mean when we talk about success in political affairs. There seems to be this sense out there, certainly in the Atlantic world, that there's not much point in being political and making an effort to be political unless we can assure ourselves from the beginning that we're somehow going to single-handedly change the world in true sort of comic book superhero style. And that, of course, is entirely absurd. Being political is an end in itself. That is, informing ourselves about the issues and arriving at a coherent position through critical analysis is an end in itself. Being right when everyone else seems to be wrong is an end in itself. Excuse me. And I don't think being political needs to somehow be qualified by achieving what in conventional terms is considered success. But having said that, I think the effectiveness of these political movements is somewhat ephemeral but very important in the sense that to one extent or another, they galvanize support as well as opposition for the issues that they're agitating. And in that sense, it compels the public discourse to move forward in a way that takes those issues into account. Where these protest movements seem to fail is that they're unable to evolve and adapt to the political realities of the day. And the political realities of the day is that the political establishment isn't very interested in what the public feels or the public has to say. They are periodically interested, usually starting about 6 months before an election, in how individuals will cast their ballot in the next round of votes, but that's about as far as it goes. The policy making process is dominated by the private sector and by corporate funded think tanks, essentially populated by people who consider themselves to be experts and who therefore are quite dismissive of the positions expressed by protesters, often, I would say, with very good reason. For example, this notion that we see arising throughout the Atlantic world that we can fix all that's wrong and achieve a measure of economic and social justice by taking away all the money from billionaires and spreading it around is really quite absurd. And it just doesn't work that way. Even if it could be done, it wouldn't make a big difference to the lives of working people, even if they got their share of all of the money that was taken away from billionaires. So if we come back to your question about where does the future lie, what effect can these movements like the Yellow Vest movement have? Well, they do galvanize support and opposition to the issues they embrace. They motivate people to take an interest. And in some sense, of course, the political establishment, to the extent there are votes involved, will adapt themselves to that reality. And I don't think it can go much further than that. I see really no scope for movements like this to achieve the demands that they're making across the board. I don't, for example, see that there's any chance that the Macron government is going to respond to the Yellow Vest movement by somehow maneuvering to abolish the Senate in France. But of course, the Yellow Vests have put forward and are discussing a number of issues that make perfect sense. One of the issues they've agitated about is that they feel politicians should earn less money and have fewer benefits. And I think that's a view that's pretty much held throughout the Atlantic world. Back in my day, we remember politicians as being basically low-paid people that wore tweed jackets with leather elbow patches. It was not a career path for ambitious people to choose. That seemed to all have changed sometime in the 80s, when all of a sudden all of these politicians started wearing Armani, driving flash cars, and becoming very wealthy very quickly, either while they were in office or not long after they retired from office. So certainly these movements, and the Yellow Vests in particular, are raising important issues and encouraging a level of awareness about them. That in turn, to the extent that they garner support, cries out for some response from the political establishment. But of course, and I'll stop on this, one of the problems here is that these movements are easily infiltrated, and to one extent or another, they are always infiltrated by various people, including various interests, including the security apparatus. And I certainly have the impression that support for the Yellow Vests in France is dwindling somewhat. I don't think it's anywhere near as mainstream as it might have been at the start. I think the wider middle classes and working French men and women have started to largely distance themselves from the movement, and have started to grow tired of it. And it's therefore necessary for the Yellow Vests to adapt to that reality and become somewhat more sophisticated and responsive to the reality that they now face. And I don't think they're up to it. Meanwhile, as I said earlier, one of my great concerns is the extent to which the Yellow Vests are being manipulated and used by the hard right in France to ultimately win votes in the next election and to come close, if not actually find themselves in power in France.
So, Mr. Ó Colmáin, I would like to go into the next question, which is basically about the effectiveness of this movement in France. Why is it so effective among French people, and it has brought lots of people in the streets? Was it effective generally, and also answering the needs and the things that French people were trying to seek in France, or not?
Well, I think what the movement has highlighted is that the core of French society, the core of the French working class are in revolt against the state. And the reason why the working class is in revolt against the state is because of austerity, because of the deindustrialization that has been taking place over the past 30 years of the French economy. There are no more jobs in France. There are no more quality jobs. The manufacturing sector has been gutted. You have massive outsourcing. You have deindustrialization. You have a process of desertification taking place all over the country, whereby people are having to, uproot and go to the big cities like Paris to look for work. There isn't really any work there. And right now you have a situation where there's no representative government as such. I mean, you have an oligarchy with a facade. The oligarchy is a technocracy, essentially. It runs itself. And Emmanuel Macron was selected essentially by the oligarchs, Jacques Attali in particular, who is the most prominent of the oligarchs who run the French economy. He was selected by them to run France on behalf of, Rothschild and Co. for want of a better term. That's where he comes from, and that's what he represents. And so there's a rebellion against that. The Gilets jaunes movement is a genuinely grassroots movement, and that's the reason why the left, as such, have nothing to do with it. As I've explained many times before, the left is essentially a political ideology representing decadence, sexual perversion, mass immigrationism,
anything but working class interests. They don't have any particular vision of society that can appeal to the working class in any European country, and nobody listens to them because nobody buys that anymore. So, for example, recently you saw that Jean-Luc Mélenchon, his party, La France Insoumise, which means France Unbowed in English, that party got about 6% of the vote in the European elections. They're out of the race, and they're out of the race because nobody's listening to them. Nobody wants to listen to this kind of nonsense that they come out with. And so there is a kind of political vacuum right now. The Gilets jaunes movement itself is being described as far right. That doesn't really mean anything because it's quite heterogeneous as a movement. That is to say, you have a lot of people there who identify neither left nor right. I think this is kind of a sentiment of our time. And you certainly have people, nationalists in there, but nationalists of different colour. What you don't have there are Zionists. You don't have people representing neoliberalism. You don't have any of the traditional right-wing parties. You do have, I would say, movements that are nationalist, movements that are socially oriented. I wouldn't say socialist because you don't have the left as such. The left doesn't have really anything to do with this movement. One of the ways in which the mass media discredit this movement is by trying to call it far right, and far right then presumably means bad, and that sort of disqualifies the genuine concerns of the working class. And so anti-fascism really is an arm of the ruling class, and it's you know, it's used ad nauseum. So these people are described as fascists, as Nazis, as far right, and so on, and anti-Semitic, of course. And those terms are basically terms of demonization, of terms of exclusion, and ways of dismissing the movement. The real leaders are I wouldn't say that there are any official real leaders of any consequence, but people like Alain Soral, Yvon Benedetti, these people have emerged as major leaders of the Gilets jaunes, and they're associated with the far right. But again, doesn't really mean anything as such. Yvon Benedetti is pro-Palestinian, pro-Iranian, very strong anti-imperialist positions. He's for multipolarity globally. He's for national sovereignty. Alain Soral comes from the left, was a member of the Communist Party, moved to the National Front in order to basically try and orient it in a more anti-globalization direction. That didn't really work, but it was a courageous and sort of move, and he's been one of the most avant-garde intellectuals in France, which is why he's currently facing multiple prison sentences. So he is a potential political prisoner right now. You have a process of criminalization taking place, whereby by using the anti-Semitic card, you basically dismiss the entire movement. Another intellectual who's emerged in this movement, very important figure, is Etienne Chouard. And Etienne Chouard is a very important economist, and he has kind of become a major thinker of the Yellow Vest movement. But to give you an indication of the way in which the left have tried to destroy this movement, you only have to look at what happened to him recently. He was interviewed by a fake left-wing media outlet called Le Média. It's basically the French, I guess, equivalent of Democracy Now! Fake left-wing media, corporate funded and so on. They interviewed Etienne Chouard, and they basically the interview just turned around the gas chambers, whether he believed in gas chambers. That was basically what they were asking about. Do you believe in gas chambers? And, he laughed. I mean, as you kind of would, if you were asked, suddenly you're talking about gas chambers and the Holocaust. Like, well, how do we get from the yellow vest to the Holocaust? And he just said, he responded by saying, this is, it's kind of crazy. Why are you asking me about gas chambers? And, well, they basically, the two guys who were interviewing him, it was like a hatchet job. They basically they did a hatchet job on him, and the following day, all the media were saying Etienne Chouard is a negationist and he's anti-Semitic and so on. They did that again recently to him during a radio show where he was talking, and they got him again on anti-Semitism. Said, "Are you anti-Semitic or something?" And he lost his temper and said, everyone should have the right to be anti-Semitic. Well, why am I constantly being why are you pushing this thing? What's this thing about anti-Semitism? And he was making an intellectual point, which is you should have the right to be pro or anti whatever you want.
You actually mentioned very interesting points, about the also the initiation of this whole movement, and also about the leaders who are actually leading this movement in France. But here comes a very important question about the achievement or the amount of achievements of this movement. How much do you think this Gilets jaunes or Yellow Vest movement has achieved its goals or its so-called targets?
I would say to come back to Etienne Chouard and what I was just saying about what's being done to him now, why he's being demonized. The point really, the point I was trying to make is the reason why he's being demonized is because they can't defeat this movement as a movement. Now, the movement itself doesn't look like it's going to take power. I think what we see taking place here is, a process of consciousness developing, social consciousness, and people like Etienne Chouard are nonetheless dangerous intellectuals for the system, and they've emerged as the major leaders here ideologically. So I think that the Macron regime could continue for a very long time. I mean, he has all of the weight of the oligarchy behind him, of their power, but what we're seeing really is right now is a failure of all the attempts of the oligarchy to prevent social revolt from happening. And one of the last sort of strategies of the oligarchy was fake leftism, fake left-wing media, the likes of Mélenchon, Trotskyism, and so on. That's finished, I think. I just don't see a future there for them right now. So it's opened up a new vista, a new range of possibilities, political possibilities, now that the petit bourgeois hysterical leftists are out of the way, and we can talk about real issues that matter to ordinary working people. So I think I would be positive, but I don't see any major revolution coming, as in any storming of the Bastille, as it were. I don't think that you're going to see that kind of happening very soon. But nonetheless, you could see new interesting political parties developing out of this. So I would be cautiously optimistic about its future. But I think that I think one of the things here that needs to be said is, and I said this at the start, this started as a rebellion against the raising of the augmentation of taxes on fuel, and that is due to the global warming agenda. And the global warming agenda has been accepted by almost every single country in the world, bar the United States right now, which is putting out, which should wake people up that there is another scientific view of this that people are unaware of, and there should be a debate about it, and that's something you're not allowed to have. It's, again, good news to see the left getting a whipping and being pushed out of the way, because at least now we can maybe have a debate about global warming and allow the scientists who dispute the facts and figures relating to man-made climate change, allow them to step into the arena and to explain to us what they think is going on. Most people are unaware that there is even another view, and that's very important. Why? Because the energy transition that these people are trying to implement is it's going to be extremely damaging to the environment. So, for example, if you try to go from a high-tech nuclear economy like France to a wind-powered economy, you would completely destroy the countryside. I mean, it's undoable. You can't do that. And yet they're building wind turbines all over the place, all over Europe. And, of course, these wind turbines are causing havoc for the environment, but also for people living near them. So these are issues that need to be brought into more the mainstream debate here. And I haven't seen that yet. And similarly, all the other issues that are happening. We have, I've mentioned it before. The sexual revolution that's going on, sexualization of children in our schools, pushing gender theory on primary school kids. This is another war that's going on. It's about the future of the country. All these issues really need to be brought together into a coherent whole. Now, they are being discussed by the chief political opposition in France, which is the Égalité et Représentation website run by Alain Soral, which is itself a movement now within the Yellow Vests. And of course, that is really the opposition. That's where the opposition is. And what they fear about this movement of Égalité et Réconciliation is that it's complex. It has a lot of. It's not a racist movement. It's not xenophobic. It's not necessarily right wing or necessarily left wing. It transcends political traditions, and it's bringing an awful lot of people in together. People who are, French in origin, but also immigrants in France. I do a radio show there with Youssef Hindi. He's Moroccan. I'm Irish. So where it's a platform really which is bringing people together to think through these issues, and I think that's really the only platform right now that is sort of ticking all the boxes on all these issues I've mentioned, and as a movement coalescing around it.
I see. Thank you so very much for the explanation. And as you mentioned, there are also some other aspects that we definitely need to focus on. Different, for example, different details of this movement, and I'm sure in future we will have more to discuss because it is still a going on issue and still going on movement. So hopefully we can have more talks about it. All right. Thank you so very much for your informative and fruitful talks about Gilets jaunes. Hereby, I would like to put an end to this episode of The Fact, and I would like to thank Mr. Grossman from Indonesia and also Mr. Ó Colmáin from France for your fruitful participation in this episode. For our followers, you can actually follow our programs in our YouTube channel, and hopefully we will be at your service next week with another subject concerning international issues. Thank you so very much, and goodbye.